March 12, 2014, started like any other day for the 61-year-old captain. A seasoned veteran with 23,800 flight hours under his belt, he woke up feeling optimistic. The day before, he had visited his cardiologist, and the news had been positive. His medical clearance for another year was likely, despite the bypass surgery he had undergone in 2011. This was a man who had spent over 2 decades flying, particularly in the Airbus A320, and his passion for aviation had never waned. He had just wrapped up a day off, relaxing before a red-eye flight the next morning, and he was eager to return to work. But on March 13, 2014, things were about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. The captain's journey began at 04:45, when he woke up feeling rested. He dressed in his uniform, drove to his home airport in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and then caught a jump seat ride to Charlotte, North Carolina. After a smooth landing and a quick 90-minute nap, he arrived at Charlotte at around 07:30. His first flight was now behind him, and he was ready to begin his duty. Here, he met his co-pilot, a 62-year-old first officer, equally experienced with 13,000 flight hours, including 4,700 hours on the Airbus A320. Together, they represented a well-rested and highly experienced crew, both of whom had impeccable training records. It is crucial to note that this was an ordinary, highly competent crew. In theory, nothing about them stood out as a reason for what was about to unfold. This emphasizes a key point. Aviation, by its nature, is filled with complexities, and even the most experienced pilots can face the unexpected. Their first 2 flights, Charlotte to Tampa and Tampa to Philadelphia, went without incident. Weather conditions were routine, with some gusty winds forecasted in the Philadelphia area, but nothing alarming. After arriving in Philadelphia at 16:49, they were told they would need to change aircraft for their final leg to Fort Lauderdale. Aircraft changes are standard in aviation, but are often time-sensitive. The crew had only 60 minutes to make the transition, which is tight, but not uncommon. As the captain conversed with the dispatcher, the first officer went into the cockpit to begin preparing the new aircraft, an Airbus A320 that was 15 years old, with no known technical issues. Despite the short turnaround, everything appeared normal. Now, let's talk about a key technical detail: the flex temperature takeoff thrust setting. This is where the story begins to intertwine with the more technical aspects of aviation. The Airbus A320, like many commercial aircraft, has engines capable of producing much more thrust than typically required for takeoff. This extra thrust capacity is essential for operating at airports with hot temperatures, high altitudes, or in areas with obstacles that require additional power. However, using the full thrust capacity can lead to increased engine wear, higher fuel consumption, and louder engine noise, factors that airlines try to minimize unless absolutely necessary. The flex temperature setting is a method of reducing the engine thrust during takeoff. By selecting a lower thrust level, based on the ambient temperature and runway conditions, the aircraft consumes less fuel, reduces engine strain, and creates less noise, while still maintaining the necessary performance for takeoff. This adjustment is routine, but when something goes wrong in these settings, or during the complex interaction of systems, it can be a contributing factor to a much bigger problem. In this case, the Airbus A320, like many aircraft, was built to allow flexibility in how its engines were used, offering the airline operational advantages. But the question is, what happens when a seemingly minor decision, like setting the flex temperature just right, goes wrong? Let's step back and recall other incidents where seemingly ordinary settings and decisions led to disaster. Take, for example, Air France Flight 447 in 2009, where a combination of equipment malfunction and human error in managing flight systems in a storm led to catastrophic consequences. Although it was a different aircraft and a vastly different situation, The principle remains. Aviation is a delicate system where small errors can cascade into major problems. In the case of this US Airways flight, what seemed to be a routine aircraft change was only the start of a series of technical factors that would soon escalate beyond anyone's expectations. As we move forward, we'll see how decisions made in the cockpit and system failures that should have been minor began to collide in ways that none of the crew could foresee. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the chain of events and technical issues that led to the unexpected rejection of takeoff, even with a perfectly functional aircraft. The fascinating world of aviation is never as simple as it seems, and sometimes the smallest details have the biggest consequences. To ensure safe takeoffs without overburdening the engine, aircraft manufacturers, including those behind the Airbus A320, have created systems to derate the engines. Essentially, this involves reducing the engine thrust to only the necessary level for takeoff, thus minimizing wear, fuel consumption, and noise. But the question arises, how exactly do pilots determine how much thrust is needed, especially under varying conditions like temperature, altitude, and runway length? In the case of the Airbus A320, this is done through the flex temperature setting, which the pilots calculate and input into the Flight Management Computer, FMC. The concept behind this is quite ingenious. Pilots input a temperature that tricks the engine into thinking the outside air temperature is higher than it actually is. This results in the engine producing less thrust, but still enough to ensure a safe takeoff. It's essentially a way of using the engine more efficiently, reducing wear and tear while conserving fuel. For those familiar with different aircraft, this concept is similar to the assumed temperature setting used on the Boeing 737. On my own aircraft, the 737, the process is quite similar, with pilots adjusting the assumed temperature to reduce thrust and optimize engine performance based on specific takeoff conditions. While these adjustments are routine for experienced pilots, it's essential that the flex temperature is recalculated every time there's a change in takeoff conditions, such as a different intersection, runway, or other factors that could affect performance. This leads us to the important point of reconfirmation. Each time there's a change that affects takeoff, whether it's a runway switch, a new intersection, or a revised flight path, the flex temperature needs to be rechecked. The reason is simple. Changes in the aircraft's weight, runway length, or environmental conditions can directly impact the required engine thrust. A mismatch in any of these settings could lead to underperformance or, in extreme cases, failure to take off safely. Let's bring this down to the real-world implications, though. Flex thrust can only be used if two key elements are satisfied. The valid flex temperature must be correctly entered into the FMC, and the throttle levers must be moved into the flex MCT detent. To break that down, the Airbus A320 has 5 throttle detents. Starting from idle, the levers can move into reverse thrust, climb thrust, CL, flex thrust, flex MCT, max continuous thrust, MCT, and finally into the takeoff thrust setting known as TOGA, takeoff go around. This setup means that the pilots need to be meticulous. The correct temperature entry in the FMC needs to align with the engine's actual needs, and the thrust levers must be positioned precisely in the flex MCT detent to activate the flex thrust. Any error in this process could lead to engine underperformance during takeoff, with catastrophic consequences. Now, let's shift our focus to another crucial system, the electronic, centralized aircraft monitoring, ECAM. This system processes and displays important data about the aircraft's engine and other critical systems, alerting the crew to any malfunctions. It is a computer network connected to 2 System Data Acquisition Concentrators, SDACs, and 2 Flight Warning Computers, FWCs. The ECAM provides real-time feedback on the status of the aircraft and issues warnings, which are color-coded according to their severity. Red alerts require immediate action. Amber alerts indicate the need for awareness, but no immediate action. Green means everything is normal. In the case of an amber alert, There are two sublevels. Level 1 simply causes the Amber Alert to appear on the screen, while Level 2 also triggers a must caution warning along with an oral chime. It's these subtle, yet significant alerts that could make all the difference in the cockpit. Here's where things get interesting. Airbus aircraft are also known for their unique RETARD alert, which sounds during the landing flare. The alert, which repeats retard, retard, as the pilots reduce thrust for landing, is clear and often a bit alarming. But interestingly, this same alert can also be triggered by an obscure secondary reason. This obscure factor will soon play a pivotal role in the events that unfolded on the day of the incident. This brings us back to the essential point. Even in the most routine flight operations, small changes in settings, systems, or processes can lead to larger consequences. Just like the cautionary tales of similar incidents in aviation history, like the tragic Air France Flight 447 crash in 2009, where errors in understanding system alerts and managing aircraft performance under extreme conditions led to disaster, small but crucial missteps can escalate rapidly. As we continue to unpack the events of March 13, 2014, it's clear that these intricate systems, though designed to enhance safety, are not foolproof. Every action, every setting, every system alert is part of an interconnected web, and understanding each component's role can be the difference between a successful takeoff and an emergency on the runway. On the day of the incident, the crew of US Airways Flight 1702 seemed to have everything under control. The weather was clear, the aircraft was in good condition, and both the captain and first officer were highly experienced. But, as often happens in aviation, it was the small, unnoticed details that began to add up, setting the stage for what would soon unfold. The captain, a seasoned pilot with 23,800 flight hours, had just come off a successful medical checkup, and everything seemed to be falling into place for a smooth flight. His first officer was equally experienced, with 13,000 flight hours, and both pilots had a clean, impeccable record. They were ready to operate the Airbus A320 for the last leg of their journey to Fort Lauderdale. However, things began to go wrong when the first officer entered the wrong runway in the Flight Management Computer, FMC. Instead of selecting runway 27L, as indicated in the flight plan, she mistakenly selected runway 27R. This was a simple error that, under normal circumstances, should have been caught during the ATC route clearance verification process. Unfortunately, the error slipped through the cracks. It's easy to imagine how this could happen. Runway selection buttons are right next to each other on the FMC, and in the rush of preparing for a tight schedule, the crew might have overlooked this small but crucial detail. The missed verification during the ATC clearance added to the complexity. In aviation, these verification checks are vital, especially when dealing with complex systems like the FMC. But when time pressure comes into play, they can sometimes be rushed or skipped. The rest of the aircraft setup was completed without issue, and by 1702, Flight 1702 was pushed back from its stand, 2 minutes behind schedule, with 154 passengers on board. The weather conditions were reported as clear skies, good visibility, and winds coming from 290 degrees at 18 knots, gusting to 28 knots. These winds, though a little gusty, were aligned with the runway, and the conditions didn't raise any immediate concerns. However, the ATIS still indicated runway 27L, providing yet another opportunity for the crew to verify their runway selection. But once again, this chance was missed. Just before the pushback, the crew was advised that the earliest departure clearance would be at 1829, which led the captain to decide to start only one engine and taxi out with a single engine configuration. This is a common practice among many airlines, as it saves fuel and reduces emissions. However, this decision also added a layer of complexity. Operating with only one engine during taxi meant that the crew would need to manage the aircraft's performance carefully, ensuring a smooth restart of the second engine once they were ready to line up for takeoff. In my own experience, this practice isn't adopted in all airlines, as it increases workload closer to the runway and adds complexity to the operation. At 17:54, the final weight and balance information was sent to the crew, and the first officer entered the data into the system. Despite all these minor oversights and rushed decisions, everything still appeared to be moving along without issue. However, the combination of small mistakes, like the wrong runway selection and the rush to meet deadlines, began to compound. These seemingly trivial errors were about to have serious consequences in the critical moments that followed. In aviation, as we've seen in incidents like Air France Flight 447, it's often the accumulation of small, overlooked errors that snowball into catastrophic consequences. In this case, the missed verification of the runway choice, the rushed nature of the final checks, and the decision to taxi on a single engine set the stage for a series of unfortunate events. These small mistakes, when compounded by external pressures and a rushed environment, can lead to major complications. As we continue to follow the flight's progress, it becomes clear that in aviation, the devil is often in the details, and one small oversight can lead to a far larger issue. As the crew prepared for takeoff, things seemed to be moving along smoothly. However, it was during this phase that some critical errors began to surface. The first officer, while entering data into the flight management computer, FMC, either manually or using the uplink function, had inadvertently left the departure runway unchanged. But when the crew contacted the ground controller at 18:08, they were cleared to taxi toward runway 27L, not the 27R that had been input into the FMC. This was the first chance for the crew to spot the discrepancy in the runway selection. However, since the taxi out was uneventful and they were soon at the back of the departure queue, the error wasn't immediately addressed. The aircraft was number 6 in line, and during this wait, the captain started the second engine and performed a flight control check. By 18:21:22, the crew had switched over to the tower controller, and they were now next in line for departure. However, a distraction occurred at this critical juncture. As the first officer was completing the taxi checklist, she was interrupted by a call from the cabin crew informing her that a passenger was in the toilet. This minor disruption, though resolved quickly when the passenger returned to their seat, is an excellent example of how distractions can interfere with the proper execution of a flight plan. Any disruption in a pilot's concentration adds an increased risk of mistakes, something that can have profound implications, especially in aviation. This brings us to a crucial point. Checklists and procedures are essential in maintaining safety, particularly in busy or distracted environments. If pilots start rhyming checklists, reading through them without full attention, the proper procedure is to stop and restart the checklist from the beginning. In this case, the first officer was working on a checklist that included verifying the correct takeoff speeds and performance settings, a critical step that should have referenced the correct runway in the FMC. However, due to the disruption, this wasn't checked thoroughly. The correct runway should have been displayed both on the FMC CDU and the navigational display. Unfortunately, because the proper reference point was missed in the checklist flow, the crew did not spot the error. By the time they received their clearance to line up and wait on runway 27L, the captain, who was doing his own cross-check, noticed the error in the FMC. The runway was still set to 27R. Here lies a pivotal moment. With the aircraft approaching the active runway, the captain recognized the error, but instead of calling the ground controller back to report the mistake and request additional time, he chose to continue taxiing. This decision, though not unusual in some situations, is fraught with risk. Changing the runway selection on the fly could introduce significant complications, but the captain proceeded to slowly taxi into position while instructing the first officer to quickly correct the runway selection. At 18:22:40, The first officer made the change, completing it in under 30 seconds. This is where the problem escalated. When the runway was changed in the FMC, all the performance data that had been previously entered, such as the V-speeds and flex temperature, automatically reset. The FMC requires specific performance data for each runway, considering factors like runway length, slope, and surrounding obstacles. Even when runways are parallel, these factors can differ significantly. As the first officer hurried to complete the change, she failed to notice that the FMC had left the performance fields blank, with prompts for the previous figures displayed in blue next to the empty fields. An amber scratchpad message displayed the reminder, "Check takeoff data," and the red speed select message appeared on the primary flight displays, PFDs. These warnings are designed to draw attention to missing or incorrect data, but in her rush, the first officer didn't recognize the importance of these messages. This rush to complete the runway change is an example of how even small mistakes can cascade under time pressure. The rushed action meant that the performance fields, which should have been manually filled in to ensure correct takeoff speeds, were left blank. This was an issue that could have been easily overlooked, and it sets the stage for what happens next. In the critical moments before takeoff, the captain was also occupied with maneuvering the aircraft and ensuring that both the runway and approach path were clear of traffic. This divided attention meant that both pilots missed the glaring issue in the FMC. No performance data had been input for the newly selected runway. As a result, the aircraft was now on the runway with incomplete data, setting the stage for a potential disaster. This sequence of small, overlooked details, a missed runway verification, a rushed checklist, and the failure to input performance data correctly, demonstrates how even highly trained pilots can be caught in the complexities of aviation under stress. Each small oversight built on the last, creating a scenario where safety was compromised by a combination of factors. As the aircraft lined up for departure, there was a crucial issue that had gone unnoticed by the crew. The FMC, having been changed in haste, had no V-speeds or flex temperature set. The thrust settings were not configured properly, and yet the aircraft was preparing for takeoff. This is where crew resource management, CRM, comes into play, especially in moments like these. If you're a first officer, this scenario is a perfect example of when you absolutely must speak up. Captains, like all pilots, are focused on getting the flight off the ground. But if a critical procedure, such as changing the runway in the FMC, is rushed, it's vital to take a step back and ensure the task is done correctly. The first officer could have asked the captain to wait a few more minutes to complete the task, even if that meant delaying the departure slightly. CRM training often emphasizes the importance of speaking up when something is wrong, especially when safety is at stake. But in everyday operations, it's often these smaller, seemingly insignificant moments, like missing a checklist item or rushing a procedure, that require the first officer to assert themselves. This isn't just an aviation lesson. It applies to almost any profession where speaking up can prevent mistakes before they become disasters. At 18:23:15, about 15 seconds after the runway change was completed, the crew was cleared for takeoff, and the first officer read the clearance back. The captain then moved the thrust levers into the climb detent, and 9 seconds later, into the flex detent. Simultaneously, the captain pushed the side stick forward to apply more pressure on the nose wheel, helping with the aircraft steering. However, as the aircraft began to accelerate, a one-time chime sounded in the cockpit, followed by a ECAM message indicating that the engine thrust lever was not set, with instructions to move the levers into the toga detent. The first officer immediately called out that the engine thrust levels were not set, but instead of following procedure and pushing the levers fully forward into toga, takeoff, go-around, the captain moved them into the climb detent, then back into the flex detent again, while calling out that they were set. What had happened here was that because the flex temperature hadn't been re-entered after the runway change, the system didn't know what thrust setting to apply. This generated a warning, which prompted the ECAM message. Airbus systems are generally well engineered, so even though the captain didn't push the thrust levers to the toga detent as instructed, the system would eventually adjust the thrust to maximum after about 8 seconds. However, the issue didn't end there. Since the levers remained in the flex detent, another system would soon become involved, adding complexity to the situation. Now, let's discuss the low-speed and high-speed regimes during takeoff, which are critical to understanding the decision-making process in these situations. Up to about 80 knots, we refer to the speed as the low-speed regime. During this phase, pilots can easily reject the takeoff for any reason, whether it's a master caution warning, a burst tire, or even a strange noise. The aircraft is still capable of stopping within the runway length, and any abnormal situation is often dealt with by aborting the takeoff immediately. Once the aircraft accelerates past 80 knots, it enters the high-speed regime. In this phase, rejecting a takeoff becomes more complicated. Pilots are more goal-oriented and generally will only reject the takeoff for critical failures like engine failures, fires, or unsafe aircraft conditions. If any issues arise at higher speeds, it is often safer to continue the takeoff, fly the aircraft, and then return for a landing where there is more runway to stop. In this case, the speed was still below 8 knots when the warning activated, meaning the aircraft was still in the low-speed regime. This gave the crew the option to reject the takeoff and investigate what caused the warning. The fact that the warning occurred so early in the acceleration phase presented a perfect opportunity to stop the aircraft, analyze the issue, and resolve it before continuing the flight. The problem, however, was that the crew didn't take advantage of this moment. Instead, they chose to continue with the takeoff, despite the clear warning that something wasn't right. Had the crew decided to reject the takeoff at this point, they could have investigated the missing data in the FMC, corrected the issue, and then proceeded with a properly configured takeoff. This decision, not to abort the takeoff, was critical. In aviation, these moments, when a warning is ignored or a checklist item is skipped, are where disasters often begin. The crew's decision to push forward without fully addressing the warning and ensuring that all systems were correctly configured set the stage for what would soon unfold. In a situation like this, where time pressure, distractions, and small oversights all combine, the consequences can be much more severe than they appear on the surface. The aircraft, now accelerating on runway 27L, was reaching critical speeds. However, despite all the warning signs, the captain chose to continue with the takeoff. It's difficult to know exactly what was going through his mind, but the series of events unfolding in the cockpit were beginning to cause confusion. The retard alert sounded, a warning typically associated with landing, not takeoff. This was due to the system confusing the takeoff roll with a landing because the flex temperature wasn't properly set. As the aircraft passed 86 knots, the first officer missed her 80 knots call-out, which serves as both an airspeed cross-check and a clear dividing line between the low-speed and high-speed regimes. This oversight, although seemingly small, was significant because it marked the transition point where a rejected takeoff becomes much more complex. As the aircraft continued accelerating, the retard alert blared through the cockpit, adding to the growing confusion. At this point, the captain, likely distracted by the warning and perhaps believing that he had set the thrust correctly, called out, "What did you do? You didn't load. We lost everything." It's clear that the captain was now scanning his instruments, realizing that the aircraft was missing crucial data, specifically the V-speeds. But by this time, they were already above 100 knots, and the captain, unwilling to abort the takeoff at these high speeds, decided to press on. The V-speeds had been calculated earlier, so he relied on his memory of them, continuing to accelerate despite the ongoing warning. The retard alert continued to sound, adding more tension to the cockpit. This warning, triggered by the flex temperature issue, could have been resolved easily if the captain had pushed the thrust levers into the toga detent, but that didn't happen. Instead, the captain and first officer continued their acceleration, with the alert ringing in the background, now fully aware that something wasn't right, but too committed to the takeoff to stop. At this point, the first officer assumed that the captain wouldn't attempt a takeoff without the proper V-speeds, but she didn't call this out. As the aircraft accelerated past 143 knots, approaching the V1 decision speed, the captain, feeling the speed building, said, "Well, we'll get that straight when we're airborne," and continued with the takeoff. At 18:24:09, the first officer noted that the aircraft had reached 152 knots, only 5 knots from the calculated V1. This is a critical moment. At V1, the decision speed, pilots are trained to remove their hands from the thrust levers. This is done because any rejection after V1 risks overshooting the runway, and a pilot must focus solely on getting the aircraft safely airborne. The only time a takeoff would be rejected after V1 would be in the case of a catastrophic failure, such as a dual engine failure or significant structural damage. But in this case, the captain decided to continue with the takeoff despite the warning signs. As the aircraft accelerated past 164 knots, the captain began pulling back on the side stick, initiating the aircraft's rotation. At this moment, something inside the captain's mind shifted. Perhaps it was the blaring retard alert, the absence of callouts from his first officer, a sudden gust of wind, or a combination of all these factors. Whatever it was, the captain began doubting his decision to continue the takeoff. But at this point, the aircraft was just about airborne, and with so much runway already used, the captain likely felt that it was too late to abort. However, it wasn't too late for the worst decision to be made. As the aircraft accelerated past 167 knots, the captain suddenly retarded the thrust levers to idle and pushed the side stick forward. This action, driven by doubt, had an immediate and catastrophic effect. The combination of reducing thrust to idle while simultaneously pushing the side stick forward caused the aircraft to pitch forward rapidly. The aircraft's nose suddenly dropped, and the captain, realizing the error, reversed his inputs. But by then, it was too late. At 18:24:14, the nose wheel slammed into the runway, creating a massive impact of 3.7 G. The force of the impact, combined with the captain's continued pull on the side stick, caused the aircraft to bounce back into the air, reaching a maximum height of 15 feet. The radio altimeter confirmed this brief moment of airborne flight. Surveillance cameras captured this moment, showing the aircraft airborne, but it wasn't going to stay up for long. This brief airborne moment marked the beginning of an inevitable and devastating sequence of events, all stemming from a series of small errors and misjudgments. The decision not to abort the takeoff, combined with the rushed actions and the confusion in the cockpit, led to a situation where the aircraft was no longer in a position to safely complete the flight. This moment, when the aircraft was airborne but not truly stable, encapsulates how small, seemingly insignificant mistakes in aviation can snowball into disaster. The combination of overlooked procedures, rushed actions, and doubt in critical moments all played their part in this unfolding crisis. And as the aircraft reached the peak of its ill-fated ascent, the outcome of this flight was already sealed. As the captain began to feel the aircraft take flight, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. With the thrust still at idle and doubts clouding his judgment, he pushed the side stick forward, attempting to reduce the bounce and bring the aircraft back to the ground. But by now, the aircraft had lost a significant amount of speed. As it began to descend back toward the runway, the captain initiated a pitch-up maneuver, but the result was disastrous. The aircraft touched down tail first. The main landing gear followed, but the most critical part of the landing gear, the nose gear, slammed into the runway with such force that it collapsed. The nose gear is the most delicate part of the landing gear structure, requiring careful handling during landing. Unfortunately, this delicate component was subjected to extreme forces, and the collapse of the nose gear caused the aircraft to careen down the runway. The nose scraped along the asphalt, creating a massive cloud of smoke as the aircraft slid uncontrollably. With the loss of nose-wheel steering, the crew had very limited control over the aircraft's trajectory. However, they were still able to apply the brakes, and at 18:24:48, the severely damaged aircraft finally came to a halt on the left side of runway 27L. Immediately, the cabin crew initiated an evacuation. All but one of the emergency slides were deployed, as the nose-down attitude of the aircraft prevented the slide at door 2L from reaching the ground. Despite the intense and harrowing situation, all 154 passengers and crew members were able to evacuate safely, with only 2 minor injuries reported during the evacuation process. However, the aircraft was so badly damaged that it was eventually deemed a total loss and was written off. It is reported to still be sitting on the apron at Philadelphia Airport, though if anyone has seen it, feel free to share in the comments. The investigation into the incident began immediately. The NTSB was able to interview the pilots, crew, and passengers directly, which significantly aided their efforts. After reviewing all available data, including the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the NTSB determined the probable cause of the accident to be the captain's decision to reject the takeoff after rotation and once the aircraft had passed V1, the decision speed. Contributing to the incident was the failure of the flight crew to properly follow standard operating procedures by not verifying that the FMC had been correctly set up after the runway change. The investigation also revealed that the retard warning, which had been triggered during the takeoff roll, surprised many in the aviation industry. Although the procedure was clear, thrust levers should be moved to the toga detent when the warning was heard, the pilots failed to follow this guideline. As a result, Airbus updated their guidance, stating that if the retard warning is heard during the takeoff roll, even above 80 knots, the takeoff should be rejected immediately. This updated procedure seems like a reasonable and safer course of action. If the aircraft calls for retard, it should be executed. Now, for the new and young pilots out there, this incident offers a valuable lesson. Whenever something doesn't seem right, speak up. It can be incredibly difficult to challenge the captain, especially during the takeoff roll. But a simple, "Should we stop?" could have been enough to break the captain's decision-making loop and potentially prevent this disaster. While the final decision lies with the captain, as a first officer, your voice is critical in maintaining safety. If the decision is made to continue, ensure that all standard operating procedures are followed to avoid further mistakes. The further you deviate from normal procedures, the higher the chances of errors escalating. This incident serves as a poignant reminder of how small, overlooked steps, such as not verifying the FMC settings after a runway change, or ignoring an alert like the retard warning, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The combination of rushed decisions, failure to communicate, and deviation from established procedures created a situation that could have been easily avoided with more attention to detail and adherence to the rules. Thank you for watching, and please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We always appreciate your feedback and suggestions for future topics. If you want to be part of the conversation before anyone else, consider joining my Patreon crew to get early access to videos and exclusive content. I look forward to our next hangout and answering all your questions in person. My name is Pet Hofeld, and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time.